Right. The webinar is being live streamed to Facebook. Our panelists have entered the room. And I guess we're going to start. Chris, are you going to begin with some opening remarks?
I will. All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Chris Conway. I'm the Executive Director of the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce, and I'm happy to welcome you to the latest in our Colorful Conversations series. This program is facilitated by our Minority Business Network and is brought to you through the generous support of Comcast Business. Today's topic is nutrition, and as we have done in the past with these forums, we have assembled a great panel of experts in a variety of fields that are going to speak on this topic with a emphasis on solutions. Today's program will be facilitated by Christopher Clark, who is the chairperson of the Minority Business Network. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Clark.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you for the warm introduction. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I am Chris Clark. I am by day a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch, and I am happy to be the current chairman of the Minority Business Network here under the West Hartford Chamber. And we have an esteemed panel today to talk a bit about the gaps that exist in access to nutrition, particularly in communities of color here in the United States. You know, as we know, there are disparities that exist in so many aspects of American life for people in communities of color, and nutrition is by no means an exception to that rule. So what we'd like to do is talk a bit about some of the gaps that exist, why some of these gaps exist, and have our panels of experts chime in with their relative experience surrounding nutrition, and hopefully walk away with some suggestions as to how we can close these gaps and how we can all help contribute to that. But what I'd like to start off by doing is allowing each of our panelists to take a couple minutes to introduce themselves. And we will start with Jacob Lee.
Hey everybody. I am Jacob Lee. I am the former coordinator for the Furnace Street Food Ministry, which is a collaborative of 5 food subsidy programs run out of the Unitarian Universalist Church of West Hartford. They've been operating in some form for about 40 plus years, and they've been serving the community throughout the pandemic, and that's when I was working there. All 5 programs are designed to meet some portion of the community need. The Have a Heart Sandwich program delivers sandwiches every week down to House of Bread. The community breakfast was designed to be a sit-down sort of social networking while you also get a plate of food for you and your family. We also host the CT Food Share food truck now in the parking lot. We also provide a food pantry the 3rd Saturday of every month, and also provide a backpack program, which works with, I think we're up to 13 out of the 16 schools here in West Hartford to make sure that kids and their families are getting weekend nutritional support. So I'm the boots on the ground guy. That's what I like to see myself as. And so that's a little bit about me.
Awesome, and thank you. And we absolutely have to go back to that weekend nutrition point. So I'm making myself a note. Dr. Ferguson, how about you join us and tell us a bit about yourself?
Hi, thank you and welcome. Thank you for having me on this very esteemed panel. My name is Dr. Kitsa Ferguson. I am a social justice trailblazer by life, and by day, my day job is I'm principal of Capital Preparatory Magnet School here in Hartford, Connecticut. Our theme at Capital Prep is social justice, and so we have continued to work with, through our students, have continued to work on different social injustices, but food insecurity is one that we have tackled. We've had the backpack program actually at Capital Prep for a time. We have used World Vision to supply our food, boxes of food and necessities for our families. And we have our own school-based community garden. Just small efforts that we're making within the community that we exist to address the issue of food insecurity, because we know the impact that it has on our students. We see it every day and what it does to children developmentally and how it can stunt their potential so early on, and then the lasting impact of that, even when when food does become more secure for them. So I'm happy to be here today and talk about my experiences with child development around nutrition. As a social justice trailblazer, what we are doing, what we want to be involved in, and how we can be more involved in impacting our community outside of our school community, but our greater community. And thank you for having me.
Thank you again for joining us. Dr. Martin.
Hi, everybody. Happy Thursday. Please call me Katie. Dr. Ferguson, I just love your title of social justice pioneer, advocate,
Trailblazer.
Trailblazer.
Trailblazer,
Oof, that's powerful. I love it. I work at Connecticut Food Share, the recently merged food bank of Connecticut Food Bank and Food Share. And I am the executive director of our Institute for Hunger Research and Solutions, with an emphasis on solutions. And I'm really passionate about the issue of food insecurity in our wealthy state and our wealthy country. And I've devoted my career to conducting research on different programs to try to identify more systemic and long-term solutions to food insecurity. And I have the pleasure right now of not only working with food pantries and agencies here in Connecticut, but a lot of our work is national. So we work with Feeding America, other food banks and food pantries around the country to identify better practices for addressing food insecurity. And we learn a ton from others and then try to bring that back home here in Connecticut. And I was pleased a year ago, I wrote a book that was published March 9th. So we're approaching the 1-year mark. It's called Reinventing Food Banks and Pantries, New Tools to End Hunger. And it's exciting. It's been out about a year, and it's exciting to see the impact that it's having. And it's about a paradigm shift. So the work that we do through our institute and what I wrote about in my book is how we can think differently about the issue of hunger. It's my firm belief that it takes more than food to end hunger. It's rooted in systemic inequalities. And I'm excited to be talking about that with everybody here today. So thanks for having me.
We're excited to have you, Katie. So thank you for joining us. And last but by no means least, Dr. Cooksey.
Good afternoon, everyone. So excited to join today's panel, and looking forward to a fruitful, productive conversation. I am Dr. Kristen Cooksey Stowers. I'm an assistant professor of health disparities at UConn Allied Health Sciences and the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity. And my work focuses on both dismantling structural racism in the food banking system and also in the built food environment. So I've done a lot of work in food pantries in the state of Connecticut, actually having had collaborated with Katie as a postdoc on the SWAP system, but since sort of moving forward in my work to really look at a national level in a project we collaborated with Feeding America to look at what are food banks doing to advance health equity and racial equity in particular. And so to get a sense of what are the innovative strategies, what are the barriers, and how inclusive are at this point in the journey, if you will. The other key area of my work focuses on food swamp neighborhoods, and I bring a lot of environmental justice and policy implications and frameworks to that work, because my work has showed that Black and Brown folks are disproportionately living in food swamp neighborhoods, which are areas that are inundated with unhealthy food retail relative to healthier alternatives. The heart behind my work is, bringing community-based participatory action. I've already heard folks say action and solutions. It's all about the so what and what do we do next, bringing more voices to the table. So inclusive, equitable, authentic resident engagement are the sort of themes and the heart that I bring to that work every day. And yes, so excited to chat more.
So this is awesome. So we have a very experienced, very well informed, and very passionate panel. So I can't wait to dive in. So I'll start with the first question. What exactly does a healthy diet look like? And I know there's a lot of ways to frame the response to that, but I would love to hear each of your perspectives as to what a healthy diet is. And then we could probably dovetail and say why that's important.
Yeah, I'll jump in first because it's such a tricky, good question. And years ago, when I was spending time in food pantries and encouraging food pantry directors to promote healthy food, I realized most of us have no clue, what exactly that means and what that looks like. And working with the Yukon Red Center and others, we developed a stoplight system that's called SWAP, Supporting Wellness at Pantries. That is a simple tool to help identify which foods are healthier than others that should be chosen often, sometimes, or rarely. And then nationally, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and their Healthy Eating Research Program convened a panel of experts to help identify what do we mean by healthy food specifically for the charitable food system. So especially if you are working with families who are on a limited budget. And so SWAP helped inform that work to some degree as a foundation, but there are new guidelines that are really simple. So you can identify, okay, if you're looking at a soup or a box of cereal or dairy product, and you look at 3 nutrients: saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars, because those are the ones that are most connected to chronic disease risk, like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, obesity. And then it gives you the nutrient content of those 3 nutrients to be able to determine if it's green, yellow, or red. So that's one simple example of how to define healthy food. And we're doing a lot of work working with food banks and food pantries to use these same nutrition guidelines so that we can all be using the same framework.
So basically creating a universal language around what is a healthy food.
Right.
I did have a follow-up question to something that you mentioned. As we're talking about healthy foods and the review of these healthy foods, is there an ethnic lens put towards the review of those foods?
Yay.
Because that's a piece of conversation that tends to come up even in my own family, being an island boy, from the Caribbean,
Yeah.
that how healthy is a callaloo dish as opposed to a kale dish, right?
Right.
And, or even when Dr. Vasanth was on our last panel talking about the idea of curry, because we're not giving that up. So how do we prepare it in a way that it's still healthy and fulfilling?
Yeah, I'll answer briefly, and then I'm sure Dr. Cooksey can come on and give some more examples. It's such a good question. And I'll tell you, on the HER guidelines or our SWAP system, all produce is green. It's all choose off. And so callaloo, kale, they're all good. We should be promoting those. There's a lot of emphasis nationally in gathering feedback from neighbors, from local community folks about their cultural food preferences to better inform the work or the food that we have in our food pantries and our food banks. So identifying what foods are preferred and needed by families so that they can make a healthy meal at home. When we were developing the criteria for the HER guidelines, we intentionally decided not to rank condiments that are sauces and other flavorings that often create that cultural, taste and feel of a food. And we said a lot of those sauces and extra flavorings can be choose rarely foods. They often are high in saturated fat, sodium, and sugar, but we want to promote people cooking from home. We want people to be able to have something that tastes like, their home cooking. So a lot of good energy going towards how do we determine cultural food preferences.
Well, thank you so much for that, Katie. Did anybody else want to chime in a bit?
Yeah, just to add to Katie's points, I think that a big part of determining what's healthy, obviously the nutrient density is a big part of it, and I think the swap system and other systems are really being innovative in terms of quick cheat sheets. How can you tell? Because nutrient information is confusing, to make that easier. But we have a lot more work to do and a lot of opportunity to be as intentional about marrying that nutrient dense focus with the cultural preferences, and also to add other layers of diet restrictions. What is the doctor prescribing, and so when we get into the weeds of not only, ethnic preferences, there's also the concern of, well, what if you're a racial ethnic minority and you have diabetes, or your doctor is saying to be careful in certain things? People are getting confused about, what's next. And so I think the conversations around cultural preferred foods and then diet related illness and restrictions are kind of separated, and we need to bring it all together to make it clear for folks with the equity lens. And then I'll just quickly say, Katie's absolutely right that there's a lot more conversation about getting input from the community in terms of what they need, not just in food pantries, but as I mentioned, I do a lot of work around the built food environment. And so those same conversations or themes are popping up in sort of how do we introduce a new grocery store in the North Hartford Promise Zone, which is where I primarily work. But this is a national conversation from, rather a top-down approach, just plop the store there and FYI, hope people come, to be, authentic and respectful of the community that is there. And from the inventory and everything about it, bring in the community and their preferences, and not to sort of have a elitist and in some cases white supremacist framework that we as professionals know better than they do, and just to sort of stick it in. So I guess I'll add into the nutrient, just a focus on wellness, is a healthy diet, wellness, fueling the body, from everything from the shopping experience to the actual consumption of food is a healthy diet.
Dr. Cooksey, you said something that really resonated with me, and it flashes back to conversations that I've had with Chris Conway here at the Chamber around nutritional information being confusing, and also, quite frankly, how it's sometimes manipulated by food manufacturers. So it's like, this is healthy, the sugar content is this, and then you look at the serving size, and the serving size is for the sake of manipulating what's on the back of the package, 1/3 or 1/4 of what a person would actually consume of the given product. So does anybody have any insight into instances where that happens and how that is particularly marketed towards certain communities?
I can step in a little bit. So I'm downriver, obviously, from Katie Martin, and what we would get at the food pantry would be indicative of either what the community around us was donating to us and or what we would have access to, right? So there was already a thin veil of access restriction on what we could get to even provide people. And luckily that swap program went into the database. And so even as a food pantry runner or a program runner, we could hopefully make better informed choices ahead of time, right? But then again, the food that was coming through, it was what you see is what you get, right? So you get a can of green beans. It may not be what the person wants, but the person is in a food insecurity mindset, and they're basically just reaching for anything to get their needs fulfilled, right? And so there's a part of operating that where you're actually doing a disservice by only having certain things, and at the same time you only get access to certain things. So even as being a solution for certain parts of the community that can get access to you, you're not necessarily already set up to provide good service, right? So if you go all the way up the food chain to the USDA, and they're doing all this stuff in mass, right? You know, entire truckloads of 2-pound bags of rice, right? That's the 2-pound bag of rice that you get a choice to introduce to your community and provide to your community. And so, you know, having a program that is in a good place financially allows you a little bit more flexibility, but at the same time, that's more burden and then more asking. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I think we don't get enough complaining at the programs that I was working at. You would get certain cultural choices around like rye bread, wheat bread. And we got to a point where so many people were starting to make their own choices based on what we were providing that we have a give back table, right? So people could unpack the stuff that they wanted, but that's kind of a rarity from what I've seen. And hopefully, you know, by getting better choices upriver, the people at the handout portion of the river can be facilitating better items on the back of the cans.
So that's an interesting thing there too, Jacob. So the idea that, you know, people may be so hungry or so it's such a dire need for nutrition and a dire need for food that they'll just take whatever they get. But the upriver portion of it, to use your framework, is people are donating these things, right? Mm-hmm. So is it a case where people are going in and intentionally saying, okay, you know, these are the things that need to be donated, or are they just going, this is what I have in my cabinet and I'm not going to eat this, so let me just get rid of it?
Yeah.
I've had a lot of deep conversations, especially with friends and neighbors, because my street, for example, supports the West Hartford Town Food Pantry, right? And you'll get those 4-year-old cans of tuna. Yeah, I'm not going to give that out. But you have to have those checks in place to be able to sort everything out. And I think it's a multi-level failing, right? There's the there's this idea that, okay, I'm working, I got access to food, I can buy what I want, I'm going to donate what I don't want, right? And they're lucky to have it, right? And I think that's a really bad mindset to be in, because you're not thinking about the person, you then think of it as a kitchen spring cleaning, right? And so my first step to advocate for any type of change in that direction is to ask, right? What does the community need? What would be helpful? What does your food bank, what does your food program actually need to move forward? And then you can purchase with intention and get the right thing to the right people in a nicer way.
So asking with intention and purchasing with intention. So that touches on something that I've heard, you know, in the handful of conversations I've had with friends and you know, people working in the space. As professionals working in the space, do you find that it's more beneficial to have donations of cash versus donations of items?
Yes. So, but I just want to circle back around to something that Dr. Cooksey said about the well-being of food, of the whole food process, because it's that intersectionality that has to be taken into consideration, right? What am I predisposed to? So once a person knows what their own situation is, then you can say what is a healthy diet. Because what's a healthy diet for one person is not necessarily a healthy diet for another. And so as Dr. Cooksey was saying, it's the well-being of the whole process. And then even the mindset of, but I'm giving something as opposed I'm giving what's needed. And these are the areas that we really have to work through so that we can meet the individual need, as opposed to, like, the programs seem to be designed for the masses. And we're not looking at, but this person's intersectionalities are different than another person's intersectionalities. And so what's good for the masses is not always good for the individual. So I just wanted to circle back around to all of the great things I was hearing. And I'm thinking about, in the context of my day-to-day working in the school system, what we're up against, like what we see in our students in our community that we service. What are we up against when we even talk about, but what's a healthy diet?
Yeah. So you lead us to a great point in the conversation, because we always hear, you are what you eat. So how do we expect, people, particularly children, to flourish when they're hungry or they're malnourished? And what are some of the things that you're seeing in the school system in terms of the impacts of a lack of access to food?
Yeah, so obviously everything has been exacerbated since COVID, right? So whatever level we were at before, now it's times 1,000. And it plays out in different ways. We know that when anybody, but especially kids' basic needs are not being met, the food security piece, it stunts their development in different ways, right? It socially, emotionally, academically, we see a huge disparity in the demographics of kids that have food insecurity. And then we see how that plays out as they move along academically, and students start to the disparity and the discrepancies between what kids are actually performance level against their peers, right? And even I can look at it, my school versus another school, and where is another school situated, and who's the student population enrolled at that school. So all of those things play out. But since the pandemic, we see even more, the needs are far greater, far more severe. School is a place of stability for all of our kids. It creates that structure and predictability that students need to flourish. So I know I'm going to come, 5 days a week. I'm going to get 3 meals while I'm at school, breakfast, lunch, and I'm going to get a snack at the end of the day. And they can count on that, even if they don't know what's going to happen when they go home, or, what level of food, if food, when they get home. And the pandemic has taken that security away, and all of the programs that were in place to help mitigate the lack of food or the access of food, they all did great work, but we know that it wasn't enough, and that a lot of families went hungry, and a lot of families are still going hungry because the access hasn't been rectified, but really it was never complete to start with. So we have more behaviors this year. Students just needing to, not sure how to express themselves, not having the social skills anymore to express themselves because they've been isolated for a year and a half or so. We have beefed up what we're offering for breakfast and for lunch, and trying to provide hot breakfast. But the catch up, it's like you never really recoup what you lost in the nutrients that help with the development of students. So it does. We see it manifesting itself in many ways here at school. And, I'm interested to know, how do we put our children in a position to be successful, to overcome the developmental delays that might have occurred, the social delays. How do we get them back into a good place so that we can get to ground zero and start talking about, well, what does a well-balanced diet look like for individual populations?
Yeah, it's wild, right? I had a conversation recently with a friend of mine, Peter Mutabazi, who's been making the news as a foster father, and his recent desire to adopt and foster more and more children, based out of North Carolina. But originally he's from Uganda, and he spent a handful of years, not a handful, he spent roughly 6 years as a street child in Uganda. And he talked about, food insecurity in Uganda. And he talked about, finally finding a patron, basically somebody who was a good Samaritan and took him in. And the thing that got him to go to school and to leave this lifestyle, which was a dangerous lifestyle, but it was the only lifestyle he had known, was the availability of food, the availability of having 3 square meals a day, and how impactful that was for him. And then you fast forward and you look at this situation here, and you think of people's ideas about, Connecticut in particular. I can say, growing up in New York, our mindset was, oh, Connecticut is where all the rich people live. And it wasn't until I got here, and we're talking, almost 20 years ago, and looking at a conversation I was having with someone at I believe it was United Way at the time. And back then, Connecticut was second behind Mississippi regarding the number of children below the poverty line and in suffering from food insecurity. So a lot of us don't even really realize the impact that food insecurity has in our own state. I wanted to touch on 2 things that were mentioned, because we've used a couple of terms. Food insecurity, we've touched on a little bit, but clarification on food swamps and food deserts, and what exactly they are. What are the differences?
Sure. So the USDA probably in 2008, 2009, it's actually a term from Europe. And it defines an area that is lacking a grocery store. And I think that term has become quite popular, especially with the federal government investing resources in a food desert locator. You could hop online and find, put in your address or play around with a nice interactive map and find out, do you live in a food desert? And so the USDA defined that as an area lacking a grocery store. It needed to hit a certain benchmark of poverty, in a certain distance from the sort of core of that neighborhood to the nearest grocery store, adjusting for whether it was a rural or urban space. I actually was an economist intern when the food desert locator launched, and I was fascinated. And of course, I jumped on there and found my childhood home on the south side of Chicago, where I was born and raised. And unsurprisingly, it was a food desert. And so there's lots of debate on these type of terms, but what it did for me was it connected lived experience to description. It was finally some way to that's what I lived. But what I didn't feel or hear in the term food desert was what was there in its place. Predatory, unhealthy food retailers feeling the gap in the absence of a grocery store, right? It's just smart business and smart economics, right? People have to eat. And if there's a grocery store 5-10 miles out, they know that they should be there. They should plop there. And so over time, you see this imbalance of a lack of grocery store, supermarket, farmers markets, nutrient dense foods being replaced with retailers predominantly selling high fat, high sugar, high salt, lots of all the hypers, all the scary hypers that want to stay away. Anyone from an urban space connecting with the blue juice and the 25-cent chips, right? And who knows if they're 25 cents anymore, but that's the
waters are still a thing.
Yeah. And that is what a food swamp is. A food swamp is an area inundated with unhealthy food retail. And from a measurement and science standpoint, I was curious to learn, are these the same places? I saw that people were using them as synonyms, but the measure of a food desert only captures a grocery store or not. It does not signal anything else about the equity and balance in a neighborhood. And so when that term came up out of a New Orleans study, actually, they went to validate the food deserts in New Orleans and said, that's not really what we're seeing on the ground. Maybe it's more of a food swamp, an area inundated with unhealthy food. And it's like the end of the paper. And I'm like, whoa, I want more. That sounds like my neighborhood in Chicago. What is this food swamp thing? Where do you find them? How do I address them? And there was nothing on them at the time in 2010. And so I spent my dissertation and my career focusing on identifying, measuring food swamps, and most importantly, coming up with resident-driven solutions on how to dismantle them.
Wow. So, yeah, I would love to have you, and I hate to pick on you, Dr. Cooksey, but I would love to have you expound a bit more on the idea of predatory food. And please, anyone else jump in, because that hit my ears and I was like, oh, and I thought of examples from my own childhood. Like we weren't exactly a food desert. We had like local grocery stores and mom and pop owned grocery stores, and vegetable stores and so forth in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. But we also did have examples of those things that you talked about, the quarter waters, as we call them, like the 25 cent, miscolored, not identifiable in nature beverages.
We're in those, yeah.
Or I remember being a kid sitting around with my friends, and there was like a brand of soda that I can't even recall the name of. Oh, you know what? It was Tropical Fantasy. But we had this brand of soda, and it was horribly inexpensive. And we were just sitting around one day, like one of my buddies had one. We was like, how can they make this and make it so cheap? And then the rumor came around that it was like, some sort of like poison thing that they dropped in the hood and stay away from it. But to a degree, that was not inaccurate, right? It wasn't inaccurate. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what exactly these predatory behaviors look like and what the goal is.
Yeah, so I'll jump in quickly and then shut up so others can chime in. But it's I think one thing that we need more of in the nutrition and health advocacy space is a recognition of history. I think in our training, as professionals, you don't get a lot of history, right? In your public health and your nutrition program. And I think, I would argue that is intentional and unintentional, that there is a lack of understanding of the history of people of color in the U.S. And I bring this up because I did reach a point in my journey of, well, how did we get to this issue? Was this always the case? I had done some work with older adults in Baltimore when I was at Hopkins and heard the stories of a vibrant, robust food environment that just felt good, from the consumption, but way back to shopping and touching and feeling good food. And I wonder, when did we lose that? Where did we get to this problem? And that's not a big focal point of public health or economics, right? We start from the problem, we run all our fancy models, and then we don't ask, how did we get here? And when I looked into the history, you see the grocery stores leaving majority Black and brown neighborhoods occurred with white flight. And, sort of leaving, there's lots written on grocery store owners being fearful, not being convinced that they would be profitable, and a lot of reasons. And so they went out to the suburbs with the white folks, right? And a lot of other amenities, right? It's not just grocery stores. But again, smart but predatory practices is now there's lack of food source in the neighborhood. And as folks have mentioned, it brings in this environment of scarcity, and unfortunately brings in opportunities for more of the industry, fast food retailers, gas stations selling mystery juice, corner stores, and supply and demand. There's that onus to really provide nutrient dense food to promote well-being. That need isn't there because of the desperation now that the community is in. And that is predatory, and that is a racist practice that we've seen over time. And unfortunately, there's a judgment call on who deserves good, nutritious foods. That there's a stigma and there is a value call that we have in the food system on who is deserving or not. And so, identifying those stigmas, identifying the stereotypes, dismantling the power imbalance between those that are distributing food, making decisions on the food that's on the shelves, and then finally the ones that receive it and cook it at home. If we don't address the power dynamics that are there, then all this stuff that Dr. Ferguson is talking about in terms of what we're seeing in our kids is going to persist, because Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food is a fundamental need. We fuel ourselves to think, to work, to play, to worship. And if we can't do those things, then we have a problem. And you can dismantle a lot of our maximizing our well-being by taking away food that feeds the mind and feeds energy, and just good physiologically, with mystery food that is not real food at all. And that's what you see in a food swamp.
I would just say, I'm thinking about my neighborhood, my community that I'm in here in Hartford, and the convenience stores. And so, and the word predatory, right? So I definitely understand that when I look at some of the chain stores that exist, but a lot of these stores are mom and pop, right? That's what they can access. They don't have access to quality foods to put on their shelves. They don't have the capital resources for the quality foods to put on their shelf. Like a grocery store is expensive because a lot of the food is perishable. And so if you don't sell it within a certain window, you're not making money. You're actually losing money. But so while we do have to contend with the fast food restaurants that come in and the grocery stores that sell, all the things our kids don't need, a lot of these stores are mom and pop. And it's, they consider themselves doing a service to the community because they're bringing something to the community. And it's also their economic stability, right? So perhaps they've been pushed out of the workforce, or they're tired of the workforce, or whatever it may be. And here's a way that I can contribute to the community, and I can also be self-sufficient and take care of myself economically. And so that's part of that. I mean, there's a lot of pieces in there that speak to the injustices that are systematic, that we do have to look at the power structure, so that we really have to analyze that power structure and call it what it is, so that we can start the dismantling process and put in place what our families are really craving. But these kids, they love going to the corner stores because they know those people, right? Those are their neighbors. Those are people that care about them, and they perceive them as people that are taking care of them.
If I may quickly react to Dr. Ferguson's point, absolutely, I totally agree with you. And I wanted to just add to this something that my co-panelist Jacob Lee mentioned, which is this idea of levels in the system. And so I think that's the way that I think about these issues is it's not to to pick on the downstream, because I think food pantries are in the same boat as the corner stores and those smaller businesses, just trying to meet a need, but yet, and there are great opportunities for that. But then when you look at the research on corner store owners, like food pantry directors, they feel stuck between a rock and a hard place sometimes, between wanting to do good things and then being limited to what's upstream. And so it's not to pick on the small business and the mom and pops, though there are issues in both food pantries and in corner stores that we need more dignified shopping experiences. People, there are cases where I know back home in Southside Chicago, where I'm from, most of the corner stores have, glass between them and the owner. So, totally, I think it's both and. There's great experiences, but we also still have folks that, that need more support upstream to dismantle some of those stigmas. Let's take the glass ceilings down, and what about what's happening with the bars. And I think that part of it goes into economics, a lack of inclusion and opportunity for people of color in that same community to provide, to become a small business owner in their own community. And so that connectedness is part of it. So if you're marginalized out of economic opportunity, you're also marginalized in food. And there's a disconnect between the owners of those stores sometime and the actual community that, unfortunately perpetuates a disconnect and cultural disconnect. And so I just wanted to hop in there to clarify, I'm passionate about corner stores like food pantries, and that I think it's about systems conversations.
So as we talk about systems, one of the things that comes to mind is that upstream, right? When you think about people of color in food production, right? Because I think currently there's about the number of Black farmers by percentage is 1.5% versus back in I think it was the 40s, the ratio was closer to 20%. So like one fifth of the farmers in the United States were people of color. Black farmers in particular. How do you think that impacts the downstream?
I'll let Dr. Martin go. Sorry.
Are you on mute, Dr. Martin? Or maybe you knocked out your headphones.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. So just one other comment with moving from the definition of food desert, introducing food swamp. A newer term that is being used is food apartheid, which addresses and points to the discrimination of communities of color when it comes to economic opportunity. So really thinking of it's not just a lack of stores by circumstance, it's intentional disinvestment in communities. So it's a more provocative term that really spells out why we have lack of grocery stores. When we think about the upstream approach and then BIPOC farmers, I'll just mention, I think it is definitely in the onus of the larger players in the field. So for example, at Connecticut Food Share, we just recently passed a nutrition policy to influence the supply of healthier food that is going to be supplied to our whole network of agencies. And as part of that policy, we say we're going to gather feedback from neighbors, from people experiencing food insecurity to find out their cultural food preferences that can inform us of how do we source that food? How do we supply that food? How do we purchase healthier food? Because it shouldn't be on the backs of food pantry directors like Jacob to have to make those hard decisions. And I don't have all the details yet, but I know we are talking at Connecticut Food Share about investing more energy towards Black and brown farmers and sourcing food locally from BIPOC farmers. I know the state of Maine just passed a policy of investing more energy towards sourcing a percentage of their food from the food bank to BIPOC farmers. So being intentional about that and putting energy where we want to see this move. So upstream thinking is important. I also think we have to be more comfortable telling food donors what we're looking for, as opposed to feeling that we're just at the mercy of whoever donates food to us. So that's at the food bank and also at the food pantry level, being more explicit. These are the types of food that people in our community want and need. Help supply that instead of 4-year-old tuna cans that may or may not be of any interest in people and what they want. And designing food pantries as client choice so people can choose their food with dignity.
Yeah, I think that carries a lot of weight because we've been talking with a focus on ethnic and racial preference, but what about religious preference that goes along with food selection, right? And allowing people to make those selections on their own, and more importantly, or equally important, letting donors know that we're servicing this community and this is what we have a need for. You know, you think about donating clothes, like, yeah, you can throw a bunch of stuff in a bag and put it in a bin. But, you know, if all we have is children and you're dropping off adult clothes, you know, it's just taking up space. Right.
If I may have in here, one thing that's I think important to know about the food banking system, like, is a bit of a misnomer that the majority, especially at the pantry level, that the majority of most pantries are distributing donated products. That is a huge source, but there's also the purchasing aspect, which was mentioned, and the role of federal government and programs, just to highlight the levers that we can look to for solutions, because there may be there's some towns that have shown some really great models for like a wish list for the pantry. What are the clients asking for this Thanksgiving? And so those are fantastic programs. But we also have some really potentially heavy hitter solutions when we look at Feeding America, what they're doing and what they can do, and also federal programs like TFAP. That is sort of the SNAP of the food banking system. Those are huge sources of food for the system. And so if you work with the USDA to enhance the nutritional quality, or to sort of help the mystery box sort of view that comes from TFAP foods, then you're making a lot of headway in terms of changing what is finally seen downstream on the shelves. And so I just want to, as we're talking about systems and solutions, to just, clarify and to put out there that we have Feeding America and we have the federal government that are part of what we see in pantries. And it's important to think about those opportunities there for policy and advocacy, really for all of us, right? As we do our day-to-day work of distribution, to not forget that we can advocate and influence policy, and of the USDA. The Farm Bill has a big impact on what we see in our system, and so to not forget about those downstream, those upstream factors that drive downstream availability.
If I could jump in real quick, if that's all right, Chris.
Please do. Go for it.
Just to piggyback on what Dr. Martin, Dr. Coasley, and Dr. Ferguson have been talking about, I definitely have been resonating more with the diagnosis of food apartheid, right? It's the deliberate thing that's connected to zoning, moving, white flight, people taking the resources out of communities. Just for example, people working in Hartford, somebody did a heat map of the number of people who worked in Hartford and then where their tax revenue went after they went home after 5 p.m., right? And there's a huge disparity, right? And so while it's smart business practice for some businesses to say, okay, well, we can add these little quick cheap things to put on the shelf that don't have any nutritional value, it's not necessarily moral, right? And so it then puts the onus of the morality onto us, right? And so from a dignity standpoint of giving people the choice, right, then what am I giving people choice for, right, at a food bank level, which gets into the power conversation of like, okay, how am I as a food pantry owner, runner, coordinator, whatever you want to call it, how am I best serving the community, and what then do I need to do to connect with more community resources, because nobody's just handing you those resources, right? So luckily back, I think it was 2021, Westmore Park was an amazing partner for us, and they did a plant a row for our program. So every week we would get maybe 200, 300 pounds of produce, which unfortunately I had to wash, cut, and prepare and sort and put in the bags. But the reality is that resource doesn't exist in other places, and it doesn't exist in those places deliberately based on city planning, zoning, whether or not a small grocery store like the old Kingswood Market or Hall's Market, moved their location based on what they saw as economic impact based on the demographics. So the access is deliberately built into bus lanes, public transport, whether or not Ubers will go into certain locations, and it also impacts whether or not I'm going to have access to farmers of any ilk, whether people from over Avon Mountain are going to be willing to come and deliver and distribute, whether I have to buy that versus whether it's free. And then you combine that with the upstream stuff of what's being given to us by the USDA. And while there are positive directions, and while Dr. Martin, we have the color coding system for knowing the nutritional value, it again, by the time it gets down to the food pantry level, the USDA can't do anything about whether or not my demographic of people who are using my food pantry are all allergic to gluten. Right. So you then have to do that extra level of work, which then further puts the onus on the food pantries. And so it's almost as if, because of the deliberate mapping and segregation of towns and zoning and planning, has then pushed all of the morality aspects, the dignity aspects, and the choice aspects of getting the food to the communities back onto the nonprofits. And rather than trying to work on actual community solutions or give incentives to businesses to build that store or market, or help people with small business loans, things like that. I mean, there's a lot of different solutions in that space, right? But then again, if you're putting all the onus on the small mom and pop food bank, and they're just as low on the totem pole as far as choice, right? Like, it almost discourages people from potentially using it, making it harder. They're not getting the thing that they want. While you have dignity in the process, there ends up not being any dignity in the bag, because it's not the thing I can use at home.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of access, and I guess part of eliminating the problem upstream, or trying to help with the problem that's upstream, education and access to growing your own produce, right? What are some of the limitations that you found, particularly in the areas and in the communities you serve?
One of the limitations is space.
No.
Right. So, some communities have community gardens that are acres and acres. In the city, you don't have that as much. You don't have access to land at that capacity. So I think that is one of the, biggest issues. Other is education. Like, how do you start to grow your own produce, your own fruits, your own, what works in this region? How do I even get started? Because it's not something that we learn in school as a trade.
Right.
So someone's got to provide you with that knowledge. And I think that can be scary to people when they don't understand how to do it. And then you couple that with the access to even having your own garden to be more self-sufficient. It's burdensome in the city. It really is. And the city has done a job. They've built up these box gardens. They're probably about 12 by 12, maybe. And they're on the streets, and you can, plant the seeds and everything. They're not secure. So anybody can plant, but anybody can also alter what you put in the containers, the planter boxes. So I think that, providing access in terms of land and the education to really know what to plant, where to plant, how to cultivate, is key for that self-sufficiency to exist.
Yeah. So as we think about space and we think about education and know-how, right? Like one of the things that I've seen in recent years, the Urban League of Greater Hartford, right in Hartford, they have a hydroponics set up in the Urban League, and that's great. You can grow spices, you can grow produce, but the education that goes along with it, like I have a master's, and they were trying to explain it to me, and I'm like, it's above my head, right? Is that something that's viable? If the explanation is right, is that something that's viable that we can utilize in urban areas on a greater scale? Or does it just become something that's just far too complex and convoluted to institute?
And expensive, right? I mean, the process of it can be expensive. And so if you have, if that education is there in that partnership with Urban League or other organizations to sustain you through the education and the cycle of it, so that you own it for yourself, that you acquire the knowledge and you're able to apply it in multiple settings, you can replicate it without being at the Urban League or at a designated place, then I think that, yeah, that's viable.
It also looked like a potential flood issue if something goes wrong with using a hydroponic setup. But it was something that I saw and I was like, oh wow, this is great. It absolutely combats the argument and the issue of limited space, but what does the implementation look like? So thank you so much for answering that. For those of you who have just joined us, I thought it made sense to let you know that we are having a conversation about access to nutrition in communities of color. We are joined today by Dr. Kristen Cooksey, by Dr. Kitsa Ferguson, Dr. Katie Martin, and by Jacob Lee. So thank you all for joining us, and then thank you for your thoughts. So as we're continuing the conversation, one of the things that I wanted to double back on, it was something that Jacob had mentioned early on in the conversation, was the backpack and the backpack drives that are done. And I believe Dr. Ferguson, you were talking about the weekend nutrition initiatives. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
I can talk about the way that our program currently functions at the Fern Street Food Ministry. We call it Fern Street Backpacks. It's basically eligible to West Hartford Public School students who apply. And that can be done through their families being on various benefit packages, but the main requirement is that they're on the reduced meal program. And then our team lead, Catherine Wilson, who's amazing and has been working like so much overtime over the past 2 years. It's impressive and inspiring. She gets you on the list, and then you get added to the drop-off location. So she works currently with 13 schools. We've been in conversations with 2 other schools in West Hartford. There's, some temperature for doing in-school food pantries, but again, it comes down to resources, right? With teachers in education being so strapped for not only time, emotional, but also financial resources, there's almost nobody to run those. And so while there's a demand there, this has been one of the ways that we've been able to address it here locally. We keep the bags pretty anonymous. If there's food allergies or preferences, we try to match those too, and we also try to get in hygiene products as well, because that's also something that adds a little bit of dignity to just normal everyday life. And if your family is facing food insecurity, you're probably picking and choosing other things on your plate of whether or not you're going to purchase those. when you go out and do your shopping.
At Capital Prep, our involvement with it has been really student based. And so as a social justice school, we teach our kids to be advocates and agents of change. Students have to complete social justice capstone as a graduation requirement. It's a 1.5-year project. So through those projects, those student selected and student owned projects, food insecurity comes up often. And they will make the connection, the students will make the connection with the organizations to be able to supply. We've done the backpack program, and that's a weekend program for us where the kids pick up their backpacks at the end of Friday day. It's filled with food for the weekend, also personal supplies that they can use at home. And then they return the bag on Monday. It's a nice looking bag, so there's no shame attached to it. It looks like a piece of luggage, and kids know to come pick up their bag from a certain spot in the school, and they return it back on Monday. So that will help them sustain themselves through the weekend when, the school's not offering breakfast, lunch, and snack. We've also partnered with World Vision. Our National Junior Honor Society has formed a partnership with World Vision, where they will bring over boxes of non-perishable items, that food and household supplies. And we literally just take them outside at the end of the day, and anyone who wants to pick up a box can pick up a box. And so it is very student initiated as part of our school model. And we know how important it is. Parents are saying thank you. Kids are not feeling like I have to announce my need. I just know where to go get it met. Does it take care of our whole school population? No. But it is the work that our students are doing to be responsible citizens, to, try to meet the demands of social injustices that they see around us, and develop that sense of advocacy. And we have to take care of each other. Our community is only as strong as the people in the community. And so that's how we've addressed the food insecurity. Is it on a large scale? No. Is it meaningful? Yes, because we are creating service learning for our students to continue forward as they enter the global society.
Yeah, and I often say slay one dragon at a time, right? When you're confronted with a bunch of issues or a large scale issue, sometimes just chipping away at it, can make a world of difference, particularly when you're helping individual children and individual families, right? One of the things that kind of struck me was the idea that in some of these cases, it's needs based, or need is determined based on pre-existing or pre-disclosed needs. So like, the idea of qualifying for reduced lunch or free lunch, and it brought to mind some conversations I had with my buddy Al Marino over at Connecticut Food Share, and Al would share a lot of the stories of food insecurity that he witnessed during the pandemic, and the fact that while we are here today talking about communities of color, that food insecurity knows no zip code and it knows no color, right? So in some instances, he said, you would see Lexuses and Mercedes Benzes pulling up and, popping open the trunk in order to get food, because one of the things that came out of the pandemic in particular was an exposure on the working poor. So people who are working, who are, employed, but there's not enough money, and they make too much money to qualify for programs, but there's not enough money to feed everyone based on the expenses that they're seeing in their families. What are some of the workarounds that we have in those cases?
It's a great question. I'll dive in. We did some research during COVID, both of people who were seeking help from our services, like our drive-through distribution at Wrenchler Field in East Hartford. But we also did a convenient sample of just residents of Connecticut to ask about food access, food insecurity. And we found that the disparities that existed before COVID got worse. So folks that were already experiencing food insecurity, it got worse. But you're right, there were a lot of new folks who were living probably paycheck to paycheck, part of that ALICE population that the United Way talks about, asset limited, income constrained, employed, the working poor, who probably hadn't visited a food pantry prior to COVID and now needed to. I think it's our opportunity now to do some different type of communication, promotion, social marketing of our work to destigmatize asking for help. And I think we have an opportunity because people can relate to the fact that so many people had their jobs cut out from underneath of them by no fault of their own. It kind of normalized, the struggles, the challenges that any one of us could have faced during COVID. And my hope is that we can use this time to highlight stories of people who sought help. I've heard, kind of like Al does, we've talked with folks who said, I never thought I would ever need to go to a food pantry. Or I spoke with a woman who was getting food at the drive-through distribution who said she had always contributed, donated to Food Share, but she didn't really know where the money went. And now she was experiencing it on the other end. It's humbling, right? How do we share the story so people don't wait until it gets really bad before they get help? Because that's often what happens is people feel like that's for somebody else. It's not for me. I'm doing okay. It must be, I want to make sure that other people get the food. We need to message more that there's plenty of food for everyone. And we need to make people feel more comfortable that they can seek help when they need it.
That's huge, right? That is absolutely huge. The fact that we do have the resources to go around, there's no shame in asking for assistance. And, realistically, when you look at the data, they say the average American is unexpected $400 or $500 expense away from catastrophe, right? And like many other things, the 2 years that we spent in this pandemic has highlighted that. People losing jobs, people leaving jobs, people having unexpected healthcare expenses that can completely alter your family's financial trajectory. So in addition to the backpack program, and the weekend programs, what other resources are available for people who are experiencing food insecurity, particularly here in Connecticut?
I mean, there's absolutely tons. 211 has been a giant resource for us. 211ct.org. You can even run an assessment for somebody who's asking for help to find them more resources on other things such as, energy or help pay for heating oil, things like that. And there's various community homes, South Park Inn for people who are experiencing homelessness. And each community, the big thing to know is that each community in Connecticut is completely different, right? So some towns have resources and other towns don't, right? And so that was another thing that happened with the onslaught of the pandemic was that there was rapid response of just band-aiding and trying to come up with things that were necessary. And because they were so necessary, worldwide, but also statewide, I'm hoping that people really stick to those programs and keep them on, even though the quote unquote need has dissipated or changed or shifted. But those are always my big two things, 211ct.org. And then I personally, some of them might be on the call, but I personally think that the Department of Social Services here in West Hartford has been doing a really amazing job trying to route people to needs that they might have.
I would also stress CT 211 is the go-to. Also helping enroll folks in federal food assistance programs. So SNAP and WIC, school meals, summer meals. We should start thinking about outreach for the summer meal programs that are available and are such a great resource, but underutilized and kind of our best kept secret. So Connecticut Food Share has a SNAP outreach program. So folks who are interested in enrolling in SNAP, they can talk with somebody and do that application over the phone. But there's a lot of additional outreach, and 211 helps to guide you in those directions, but other avenues for taking advantage of the federal food assistance programs.
And what would be the big differences between what we have locally and the federal programs?
Well, they're federal programs that are
funded.
then operated here. So like SNAP is what we used to call food stamps. So it's it's run by the USDA, but it's operated here locally. So if you enroll in SNAP, then you can use your SNAP dollars, your card at most every grocery store. So the WIC Women, Infants, and Children program is a phenomenal federally funded program, but operated here locally.
Okay, so you register on a federal level, but you have access to utilizing the benefits here locally.
Absolutely. And it brings federal dollars into our local communities and feeds the local economy.
Yeah. The one additional question, and I'm sure this is on the minds of everyone who's listening to this and watching this, what can people who have the means to help do to help? Because I am a firm believer that we get a lot more lifting done when we all live together, right? And when I think about the West Hartford Chamber, that's one of the things that we do very well. We do come together, we do support each other, not just to do more and better business, but in order to help ourselves thrive as a community. So when I think about food insecurity, I know that everyone who's listening or who's happening to tune into this after the fact, it's going to go, wow, this is impactful, this is meaningful. What can I do?
So just to jump in here, I think a big part, I always go back to Maslow hierarchy of needs and sort of the principles of food justice. Those that you said are more economically sound, or I would also add, are in positions of power and privilege. One of the important things to do is to elevate voices of those that are being oppressed, and then pass the mic and get out of the way, and be okay with relinquishing that power to the folks that have that lived experience. And I say that bluntly because I am a woman of color. I'm from a humble background, but in my friends and colleagues, so we sort of say to each other, check your privilege. At this point, I am now a PhD, and I'm affiliated with UConn. And that gives me a position of privilege to speak out for folks. But what's important to me, heart, mind, and soul, is that platform then is used to elevate the voices of people that are experiencing something that I experienced as a child, but I'm not experiencing now in my day-to-day, which is being food insecure. And that's important as we address policy and advocacy, because those are the big hitters for addressing this problem. What the USDA policy, the federal policies, our friends and colleagues at Feeding America, those upstream factors and what they're doing and what they're investing in shape a lot in terms of what we see, on the day-to-day, or even at the municipal level. There are a lot of American Recovery Funds coming to the localities. Where are those funds going? Who's holding them accountable? Who is at the table to decide how things are being spent? And until we sort of have some serious conversations among, in terms of, money, power, privilege, and some of our isms being a fundamental cause of food insecurity and other diet-related health inequities, we're still scratching the surface of root cause historical issues.
So it seems to keep coming back to that root cause, right? Those historical things that go unmentioned and unnamed that continue to go, unresolved and unchanged.
Yes, and if I could just quickly follow up, one of the things that I find, and I'm a food justice person and a health equity person, but I'm trained in public policy, and so I think in terms of solutions and how to get stuff done, which I hear from my co-panelists today. I feel like we're all in good company with that focus on action. In even, calling out things like food justice and structural racism and food apartheid, which is not a replacement term for food deserts and metaphors, but it's the movement, it's the sort of historical change, it's the sort of term for the, what's happening, the theory. And then we meet the policy space where folks want to know, okay, how do I find them and how do I fix them? And terms like food deserts and food swamps are measures or ways to help dismantle food apartheid and measures for residential segregation. They're not replacement terms, but rather ways to say, because people ask, well, how do I identify where food apartheid is happening and do something about it, right? Once it gets into that space, policymakers want to know how to find them and how to address them. Right? We disagree on the food desert term in a lot of spaces, but one thing you can give it credit for is that it allowed the federal government to allocate some priority spaces for funding and investment. And so I agree with a lot of the critiques of food swamp and food desert metaphors, but we want to continue to think about practical measures that can inform action from policy, but also among planners, because planners think in folks in the zoning world, they think in the same way. Where are the issues and how do we map them, and how then do we do those focused conversations?
Wow. So thank you all for your contributions. We are approaching, the end of our time together. Before we go, I just want to give everyone one last opportunity. If there's anything you want to leave our listeners with, anything that you want to get out to the general population, please take that time now.
I just want to say thank you to everyone, and thank you, Christopher, for giving us this opportunity to have this really important discussion, because we know that it impacts our lives in so many ways. My work with students and helping to develop the level of empathy that we need to not put judgment on people that have needs, right? Destigmatizing, as Dr. Martin said. I feel like if we start at with our young kids and developing that mindset that we're here to service each other, and that everything is not about profiting and making money, but that when your community thrives, everyone thrives, and then you're profitable, right? So just developing that empathy so that we get to the level that our kids are sitting at the table where decisions are being made, right? They're in those policy discussions. They're bringing their empathy with them. They're bringing the work that they've done as students and supporting each other to the table to make sure it's mixed in the conversation, and that the conversation is not always geared towards what is most profitable and what's most profitable for the people that we want to make the profit, right? Because there is some deliberate shutting out of not only the conversations, but the produce and what we're producing as a country. There is deliberate and intention around who has access and who doesn't. And so I'm just really pleased to be here in this conversation today. And it informs my work to help my kids now look at things I want them to be action oriented, but also let's start looking more deeply at the structures that are creating the social injustices and how that is impacting us. Not on an individual level, but as a community, so we can bring humanity back to these conversations and live in a way that is just more just. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson.
Yeah, thanks to everybody. Hunger is a completely preventable problem, period. So we can end this. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Katie. Direct and to the point. I love it.
Thank you for having me. I'm so fired up now. What a great, and this was amazing. I think for me, just ending off with, I think a little bit of sort of the debriefing after the State of the Union and some commentators the other night. And until we get comfortable calling out racism and injustice as a root cause, we're not going to be able to do this work and to dismantle the root causes of food insecurity. And I see folks calling that out in the chat. So just calling that out, that we need to sort of take anti-racist stances in this work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooksey. Thanks for joining us.
All of you got me fired up today, too. I'm just proud to have been asked to be here to rub elbows with people who are thinking about this and living this. And, there were moments when you're doing the work and you're on the ground and the lines are getting longer and you think you're by yourself, right? And those are tough, right? So it's just nice to be in a conversation with a bunch of people who, now you're not alone. And we can all do this work and we can all chip away at it. And I asked businesses to think about their own people, because that's a place to start talking about groups that have privilege and power in my town are the businesses who employ people. There should be no one on your team who's hungry or going without right now. And you have 100% full control to change that. Start having those one-on-ones with people and make sure that your people are being taken care of. And then see what you can do with the rest of your profits and move it out into the community.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank all of you for joining us. In the immortal words of Redman, it's time for some action. Take your opportunities to contribute, to support, and to put into action some of the things that you heard today, because it's like an ant eating an elephant. It's one little bite at a time that makes a world of difference. So on behalf of the West Hartford Chamber and the Minority Business Network, we thank you for joining us today. And let's go out and make it a better world.
I'll turn it over to